The morning air in Napa Valley felt alive, thick with the scent of sun-warmed grapes, dew-soaked earth, and the faint hum of distant farm machinery. Owning a vineyard had always been my dream, a vision I'd held since I was a kid, watching my grandfather coax miracles from the stubborn soil of his small backyard garden. For the past 5 years, my wife, Elena, and I had poured our lives into our vineyard. Long nights pruning vines, early mornings filtering the first batches of wine, and the endless hustle of tastings and events had cemented us as partners in every sense of the word. Or so I thought. It started small, a handful of little things, each insignificant on its own. The way Elena had begun dressing up for meetings, her perfume a touch heavier, her smiles a bit brighter when Raphael, our vineyard manager, was around. Raphael was a man who could charm the wings off a butterfly, an old friend of Elena's from her study abroad days in Spain. When he'd fallen on hard times, she'd insisted we hire him. I hadn't questioned it. After all, she was as invested in this vineyard as I was, right? But as the days turned into weeks, I started noticing patterns. It wasn't just the smiles or the perfume. It was the way their conversations lingered, the way she laughed at his jokes, too freely, too fully, and the subtle shift in her demeanor when he walked into a room. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, this was Elena, the woman who had built this dream with me. Surely she wouldn't jeopardize that. Surely I was reading too much into harmless camaraderie. Then came that Tuesday. The sun played hide and seek with the clouds as I adjusted the irrigation system in the main field, checking for leaks. Elena approached me with 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands, her golden hair catching the light in a way that always made me pause. Her smile was bright, but there was something forced about it, like she was trying too hard to seem casual. "Raphael wants to finalize the guest list for the gala this weekend," she said, handing me a mug. I sipped, the bitter heat of the coffee doing little to ease the knot forming in my stomach. "He can handle it. Isn't that why we pay him the big bucks?" Her laugh was short, nervous. "He just wants our input, that's all. It's not a big deal." I watched her walk away, the knot in my stomach tightening. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just today. It had been building for weeks. A quiet distance had crept into our marriage, so subtle I couldn't pinpoint when it began. Maybe it was her late nights at the office, or the way she sometimes avoided my gaze during dinner. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was everything. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the vineyard in hues of gold and crimson, my unease had morphed into determination. That night, Elena said she needed to check on the shipment logs with Raphael, a perfectly reasonable excuse, given we were prepping for the upcoming gala. But as I watched her grab her coat and head toward the barn, something inside me snapped. I decided to follow her. The vineyard at night had an otherworldly feel. The rows of grapevines stretched endlessly, their gnarled arms casting twisted shadows under the faint light of the crescent moon. The air was heavy with the scent of ripe fruit, the occasional rustle of leaves, the only sound as I moved quietly along the edge of the property. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. As I neared the barn, faint voices reached my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, intimate, conspiratorial. I crept closer, careful to keep my footsteps silent on the gravel path. Through a gap in the barn wall, I saw them. They weren't tangled in an embrace or locked in a kiss, but the closeness was undeniable. Elena leaned into Raphael, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they spoke in hushed tones. She laughed softly, a laugh I hadn't heard in weeks. He reached out, his hand grazing her back, a touch so fleeting it might have been innocent, but my gut told me otherwise. I felt a rush of anger and disbelief. This was the woman who had vowed to share her life with me, the woman who had stood by my side as we turned this barren land into something extraordinary. And now she was here, sharing laughs and whispers with a man who wasn't her husband, But I held back. Storming in and demanding answers would get me nothing but lies. Instead, I retreated into the shadows, my mind racing. If I wanted the truth, I needed proof. I needed to know how far this went, how deep the betrayal ran, and most importantly, I needed to decide what the hell I was going to do about it. The days leading up to the gala were an excruciating exercise in restraint. Knowing what I knew, or at least suspecting what I suspected, every moment felt like a battle to keep my composure. Elena was the same as always, if not a bit more attentive. She asked how I was feeling about the event, suggested I take some time off after it was over, and even cook dinner one evening, something she hadn't done in months. I wanted to believe her kindness was genuine, but every gesture now carried a bitter aftertaste, like spoiled wine. The night of the gala arrived with all the pomp and chaos I'd expected. Our vineyard was bathed in golden lights, the sprawling terrace buzzing with wealthy investors, wine critics, and influencers who barely knew the difference between a Merlot and a Shiraz. Elena was in her element, gliding through the crowd like the perfect hostess. Her dress, a deep burgundy that hugged her figure, was stunning. She wore it with an effortless confidence that used to make me feel proud. Tonight, it felt like a shield. Raphael was there too, of course. Dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit, he commanded attention with his easy charm. Every guest he spoke to seemed to hang on his every word. Watching the two of them work the room, I realized how perfectly they complemented each other. Elena's poise and Raphael's charisma created a dynamic that left everyone captivated. Everyone, it seemed, except me. I kept my distance, playing the part of the busy host. I chatted with the investors, nodded along to the critics, and smiled for photos. All the while I kept one eye on Elena and Raphael. They were careful, I'd give them that. Never standing too close, never lingering too long in conversation. But the subtle cues were there, the way their eyes found each other across the room, the fleeting smiles, the small touches disguised as accidental brushes. It wasn't until later in the evening, after most of the guests had moved outside for the fireworks display, that I saw my chance. Elena stayed back at the marble bar, topping off her glass with a crisp Sauvignon Blanc. I approached her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Enjoying yourself?" I asked casually, pouring myself a whiskey. She turned, her smile quick but tight. "Of course. The evening's perfect. Everyone seems impressed." I leaned against the bar, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "Good. It's a big night for us." "Geez, for the vineyard." "For both of us," she corrected, her eyes meeting mine. "This wouldn't have happened without your vision." Her words should have felt like a compliment, but they rang hollow. I tilted my head, studying her. "And Raphael's contributions, of course. He's been invaluable, hasn't he?" Her hand froze mid-air, the rim of her glass hovering just shy of her lips. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone light but edged with caution. "Nothing," I said with a shrug, "just acknowledging the teamwork, the partnership." I emphasized the last word, watching for her reaction. Before she could respond, Raphael appeared, his timing impeccable as always. He moved toward us with the confidence of a man who had nothing to hide, or so he thought. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice smooth, but with an undercurrent of wariness. "Perfect," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "We were just discussing partnerships. Why don't you join us for a toast?" He hesitated, glancing at Elena, who avoided his gaze. Then he reached for a glass of his own, plastering on that effortless smile. "Of course, to partnerships." I raised my glass, and we clinked. But as I looked at them over the rim of my glass, I saw the cracks beneath their polished facades. Raphael's usual charm seemed forced, his movements too deliberate. Elena's smile wavered, her hand gripping her glass a little too tightly. As the fireworks began outside, illuminating the terrace in bursts of color, I leaned closer, my voice low enough for only them to hear. Funny thing about partnerships, I said. They rely on trust. And when that trust breaks, well, things can fall apart very quickly. Elena's eyes widened, her breath hitching audibly. Raphael shifted, his composure faltering for a split second before he recovered. "Is there something you'd like to say, my friend?" Raphael asked, his voice steady but his eyes wary. I took a sip of my whiskey, savoring the burn. "Not tonight. Tonight is for celebration. Tomorrow, though, tomorrow might be a different story." With that, I set my glass down and walked away, leaving them standing there under the dim glow of the chandeliers. I didn't need to see their reactions to know I'd rattled them. Tonight wasn't about confrontation. It was about setting the stage. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in, to wonder how much I knew and what I might do. Because while they were busy building their little house of lies, I'd been busy collecting the evidence to bring it crashing down. And when it did, I planned to make sure neither of them would forget it. The night ended without fireworks, at least not the kind the guests came for. As the final sparklers fizzled on the terrace and the last toast was raised under the golden glow of the chandeliers, I felt a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. I played the role of the composed host, shaking hands and thanking guests as they left, while Elena floated through the crowd with practiced ease, her laughter and charm a mask as seamless as mine. Raphael too moved about as though nothing had happened, but his eyes avoided mine now, his posture tense when we passed. When the last guest departed, Elena turned to me in the silent, empty hall, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She looked exhausted yet radiant, her burgundy dress catching the faint light. "We pulled it off," she said softly, offering me a tired smile. "Another perfect gala." I nodded, forcing a smile of my own. "Perfect indeed." She leaned in to kiss my cheek, her lips brushing my skin lightly before she headed upstairs. "I'm going to bed. Join me?" "In a bit," I replied, watching her retreat. She paused at the top of the staircase, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the overhead light, and for a moment I saw the woman I had married, the woman I had trusted. Then she disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone in the stillness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the study, nursing another glass of whiskey, staring at the stack of photos on my desk. The investigator had delivered them earlier that day, a meticulous collection of evidence. Elena and Raphael meeting at a secluded motel, their stolen moments in the back of his car, her hand lingering on his chest in ways that no amount of explanation could justify. Each image felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into the fragile remnants of my trust. By dawn, I had made my decision. The staff meeting I called that morning was unexpected. Normally, I avoided interrupting the daily operations, unless absolutely necessary, but today was different. I gathered everyone, Elena, Raphael, the vineyard workers and the office staff, under the pergola overlooking the main fields. The sky was a brilliant blue, the rows of vines stretching endlessly in the sunlight. It should have been a perfect day. Instead, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. "Thank you all for joining me on such short notice," I began, my voice steady but firm. Elena stood to my left, her expression curious but calm, while Raphael lingered near the back, his arms crossed. "This vineyard is built on trust. It's not just about the quality of our grapes or the craftsmanship of our wine. It's about the integrity of the people behind it, and when that trust is broken, it affects everything." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The staff exchanged confused glances, but Raphael's face had gone pale. Elena's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at me. "Trust is a fragile thing," I continued, "and unfortunately, it has been shattered." Reaching into my jacket pocket, I pulled out the photos. One by one, I held them up for all to see. Gasps rippled through the group as the images came into view. Elena and Raphael in the motel parking lot, their intimate embrace captured with damning clarity. Elena's face drained of color. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You tell me," I said coldly, locking eyes with her. Raphael stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Matteo, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't!" I snapped, my voice sharp enough to cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Don't insult me with excuses. I trusted you, Raphael. I brought you into my home, my business, because I believed in your loyalty, and you repaid me with betrayal." The tension in the air was suffocating. Elena tried to speak, her voice cracking. "Matteo, please, it's not—" "Save it," I said, cutting her off. "I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime." I turned to the staff, my tone softening. "This vineyard is bigger than any one person. It's about the team, the vision we've all worked so hard to build. But I won't allow dishonesty to fester here. Raphael is no longer a part of this team, effective immediately." Raphael opened his mouth to protest, but the look I gave him silenced him. He nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched, before walking away without another word. As for Elena, I didn't have the words, not yet. I turned and walked toward the vineyard, leaving her standing alone under the pergola, the weight of her actions hanging over her like a storm cloud. For days I disappeared. I packed a small bag and left without telling anyone where I was going, not even my assistant. The streets of San Francisco became my refuge, a stark contrast to the sprawling luxury of the vineyard. I wandered aimlessly, sleeping on benches, eating from food trucks when I had the appetite, and spending hours watching the waves crash against the rocky shorelines. It was a strange kind of peace, being untethered from the life I had known. I thought about Elena often, about the years we had spent building something I thought was unbreakable. I thought about the betrayal, the lies, and the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. But more than that, I thought about the future, about whether I could rebuild, not with her, but on my own. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ocean in hues of gold and crimson, I realized something. Betrayal, like a bad harvest, leaves scars, but scars heal. And like the vines I had nurtured through storms and droughts, I could start over. The soil might be bruised, but it wasn't barren. I decided it was time to return, not to forgive, not to forget, but to reclaim what was mine. Marriage, at its core, is a collection of routines, small, consistent rhythms that form the soundtrack of a shared life. For 12 years, Sarah and I had mastered that symphony. Our mornings began the same way, coffee by the bay window, the city waking up alongside us. She'd scroll through her phone, catching up on the latest skating videos or sending texts, while I read the paper, pretending not to notice when she stole sips of my coffee, despite insisting she hated it black. Evenings were predictable but comforting. She'd curl up on the couch with her legs tucked under her, binging the latest true crime series, while I half-watched, half-replied to emails from work. When we went to bed, she'd always fall asleep first, her breathing a soft metronome in the dark. I'd lie awake sometimes, listening to her, convinced that no matter what challenges life threw our way, we were solid, we were untouchable. The skating thing started a few years ago. Sarah stumbled across an adult beginner's skating class while scrolling online one evening and decided to give it a shot. I still remember how excited she was, holding up her phone to show me the advertisement. "It's time I tried something new," she said, her eyes sparkling with determination. At first, it was just a hobby, a couple of hours every Thursday evening. But over time, it became something more. She talked about her lessons constantly, the techniques she was learning, the people she'd met, the rush she felt when she finally nailed a spin. It brought out a light in her I hadn't seen in years. I didn't mind. In fact, I encouraged it. "It's good for you," I'd say, kissing her on the forehead as she laced up her skates before heading out the door. She'd flash me that radiant smile, the one that made me fall for her all those years ago. and my heart would swell. But lately, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, small things that were easy to dismiss. She started coming home later than usual, blaming extra practice or lingering at the rink to chat with her skating friends. She was glued to her phone more often, smiling at messages she never shared with me. Once, I caught her rushing to hide her screen when I walked into the room. "Who's got you smiling like that?" I teased, leaning over her shoulder. "Just Carla," she said, mentioning her skating instructor, brushing it off so casually I didn't think to press further. The excuses seemed plausible, the explanations reasonable, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and once it took root, it was impossible to ignore. Everything changed one Thursday evening. She left for the rink as usual, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, and kissed me on the cheek. "Don't wait up," she said. "I might grab a drink with Carla after practice." "Have fun," I replied, watching her walk out the door. It wasn't until an hour later, as I was clearing the table, that I noticed she'd left her phone on the kitchen counter. That was unusual for Sarah. Her phone was practically an extension of her hand, always in use, always nearby. I picked it up, intending to call her and let her know. Then it buzzed. The screen lit up with a text notification. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place?" The sender's name caught my attention immediately. Sophia. Sophia was the skating instructor's girlfriend, or at least that's how Sarah had introduced her. I'd heard her name a handful of times in passing. Sarah would mention her when recounting anecdotes about the rink. But the tone of this message didn't match what I'd heard. It was flirty, almost conspiratorial, and it didn't sit right with me. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a joke or some kind of misunderstanding. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the unease gnawed at me. When Sarah returned home later that night, cheeks flushed from the cold and her hair damp from exertion, I tried to act normal. She set her bag by the door and greeted me with her usual smile. "How was practice?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Good," she said, pulling off her scarf. "Carla pushed me hard tonight. I think I finally got the hang of that double spin." "And Sophia, was she there?" Her hand froze mid-reach for her glass of water, just for a split second, but long enough for me to notice. "Sophia? No, she wasn't. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said, shrugging. "You've mentioned her a lot lately." Sarah laughed lightly, brushing past me toward the living room. "She's Carla's girlfriend, not mine. Nothing to worry about." I didn't press further, but her reaction didn't feel right. That split-second hesitation, the way her voice tightened just a little, it all felt off. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed the text message over and over, the words burning themselves into my memory. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place?" Sophia's name had come up too often lately, always in connection with Sarah's new routine. Was there something happening at the rink that Sarah wasn't telling me? And why did the message sound so intimate? The rhythm of our life, once steady and dependable, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos. And as much as I wanted to believe in Sarah, to trust her without question, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The following Thursday, the gnawing doubt in my chest had grown into something I couldn't ignore. Sarah left the house just as she always did, her gym bag slung casually over her shoulder, and her scarf tied neatly around her neck. She leaned in for a quick kiss at the door, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air as she pulled away. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile. "Carla and I might grab a drink after practice." "Of course," I replied, matching her smile. But as the door closed behind her, my hand instinctively tightened around the edge of the counter. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the door, the silence of the house pressing in around me. Then, as if on autopilot, I grabbed my coat and keys. The skating rink was about a 15-minute drive from our house, tucked away in a quiet part of the city. I parked a few spaces away from Sarah's car, which sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the lot. The engine still hummed softly, as though she'd only just arrived. My heart raced as I turned off my car, the cold biting at my cheeks as I stepped out. I told myself I wasn't here to spy. This wasn't about mistrust. It was about clarity. Maybe I'd see her practicing those spins she talked about, or laughing with Carla over some post-practice drinks. I needed to remind myself that I could trust her. The rink was alive with activity when I stepped inside. Families skated together in a blur of colorful scarves, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Teenagers wobbled on the ice, gripping the edges of the rink for dear life, while couples glided effortlessly, hand in hand. But my eyes weren't searching for them. I spotted her almost immediately. She wasn't on the ice, practicing spins or chatting with Carla. She was standing near the far end of the rink, tucked in a shadowed corner, talking to a man. He wasn't anyone I recognized. Tall, with dark hair slicked back, and a confident posture that suggested he wasn't here for skating lessons. His casual smile had a practiced charm, and the way he leaned in toward Sarah made my stomach churn. Her posture was relaxed, her laughter too free and easy. She reached out, playfully pushing his arm as he said something that made her smile. And then there it was, his hand lingering on her elbow, just a second too long. I froze, rooted to the spot, the world around me blurring into static. My chest tightened, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. This wasn't Carla, and it damn sure wasn't Sophia. Who the hell was this man? For a brief, reckless moment, I considered storming over there and demanding answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the small, desperate hope that I was wrong, that there was an innocent explanation for what I was seeing. Then they disappeared into the hallway, leading to the locker rooms. The corridor was dimly lit and eerily quiet, the muffled sounds of the rink fading with each step I took. I kept my distance, careful not to let my footsteps echo. Their voices reached me first, low and hushed, their words bouncing off the tiled walls. "You shouldn't be here," Sarah said, her tone hesitant but not firm enough to sound convincing. "Relax," the man replied, his voice smooth and self-assured. "No one's going to find out. Besides, you're worth the risk." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My head swam, anger bubbling up alongside a deep, gnawing hurt. "I hate sneaking around," Sarah said softly. "Do you?" he teased, his voice laced with amusement. "Because you don't seem to hate it when we're alone." I leaned against the wall, steadying myself, as the full weight of their exchange settled over me. My worst fears weren't just paranoia. They were playing out right in front of me. But then came the twist I hadn't expected. "What about Sophia?" Sarah asked, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. Sophia! My mind raced. What did Sophia have to do with this? "She's at her sister's place for the weekend," the man replied casually. "She doesn't have a clue." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Sophia, the woman who had texted my wife, whose name had haunted my thoughts for days, wasn't the one Sarah was seeing. No, this man was Sophia's boyfriend. It was all connected in ways I hadn't anticipated. My wife wasn't just betraying me. She was entangled in a web of deceit that extended beyond our marriage. I turned and left before they could spot me, my head spinning with questions and possibilities. As I stepped back into the cold night air, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a betrayal. This was something darker, more intricate, and I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. First, I needed answers. For days I carried the weight of what I had seen and heard, like an anchor dragging behind me. Every glance at Sarah felt like a blade twisting deeper into my chest. Her laugh over breakfast, her casual, "I love you," as she headed out the door, the way she brushed her fingers through my hair while we watched TV, it all felt like a cruel performance. I didn't confront her immediately. not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the truth, the whole, unvarnished truth. The betrayal wasn't just about me anymore. Sophia was being played too, strung along by the same man who'd whispered sweet nothings to my wife in that hallway. If I was going to confront Sarah, I wanted to do it in a way that exposed everything. No room for lies, no chance for her to weasel her way out of it. It started with Sophia. I reached out to her under the guise of booking a private skating lesson, messaging her through the Rink's website. We arranged to meet on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. As I sat at a small table in the Rink's cafe, sipping lukewarm coffee, I watched her approach. She was petite, with short-cropped blonde hair and a confident stride, the kind of person who didn't seem like she'd take bullshit from anyone. "David, right," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "That's me," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "So you're looking for lessons?" she asked, her voice brisk but friendly. "Actually," I said, leaning forward, "I'm here about something else, something I think you need to know." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the smile fading from her face. "Okay, what's this about?" I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of photos I'd taken that night at the rink. The images weren't perfect, grainy and taken from a distance, but they were clear enough. Sarah and the man standing too close, his hand brushing her arm, their laughter frozen in pixels. "This man," I said, pointing to him. "That's your boyfriend, isn't it?" Sophia stared at the screen, her expression hardening. "Yeah, that's Ethan. And that's my wife." My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed on. "I saw them together last Thursday. I overheard them talking in the locker room corridor. They mentioned you, and how you didn't know." Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Instead, she slumped back in her chair, her arms folding tightly across her chest. "Ethan's been acting weird lately," she said finally, her voice low. "Canceling plans, disappearing without explanations. I thought maybe it was work stress or something, but this?" She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "Bastard." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes blazing with anger. "What do you want to?" Ethan arrived late, his charm turned up to 11 as he greeted Sarah with a lingering hug. Sophia trailed behind him, her face carefully neutral. She caught my eye briefly, and I nodded. As the night wore on, the tension in the room grew, at least for me. I could barely hear the conversations around me, my focus locked on the moments between Sarah and Ethan. The way their eyes met too often, the shared glances they thought were subtle. Finally, as dessert was served, I stood and tapped my glass with a spoon. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward me. "I'd like to make a toast," I began, raising my glass. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled slightly. "To love," I said, letting the word hang in the air. "To trust, the foundation of every relationship, and to those brave enough to admit when they've been skating on thin ice." Sarah froze, her smile faltering. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a faint blush creeping up his neck. I turned to Sophia, who stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "To those who think they can play us for fools," Sophia added, her voice sharp. She turned to Ethan, fixing him with a glare that could melt ice. "You lying piece of shit!" The room erupted into chaos. Gasps and whispers filled the air as Sophia threw her drink in Ethan's face, the red wine staining his crisp white shirt. Sarah's face turned ghostly pale as she stammered, trying to form a coherent defense. I don't know what you're talking about," she blurted, her eyes darting to me then to Ethan. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice low but firm. "Don't you dare lie to me again." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her guilt had finally crushed her. By the end of the night, the truth was out, laid bare for everyone to see. Friends and family left awkwardly, murmuring their goodbyes as the tension lingered in the air. Sophia stormed out, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, Ethan trailing behind her, begging for a chance to explain. And me? I packed a bag and walked out the door without a word. For the next few days, I lived out of my car, sleeping under the stars in the park, or finding shelter in a cheap motel. It wasn't glamorous, but it was freeing in its own way. The routines of my life, the ones I thought were unshakable, had been shattered. But in the quiet moments, as I stared up at the sky, I realized something. Sometimes the only way to rebuild is to let everything fall apart first.